Welcome to the first lecture covering Chapter 13 of our textbook. The name of this chapter is Contracts in Writing and Third-Party Contracts. So let's begin. As you can tell from the title, there are two distinct topics that are in this chapter. One has to do with writing requirements for contracts, and guess what? We're going to cover that one first. And the second topic is, yes, you guessed it, interests of third parties in a contract. You may wonder, what do these two items have in common? Well, not a lot. They both have to do with contract law, so there is some tie that binds these topics together. But I think what was really going on was that the writers of the textbook thought, neither one of these topics really merit its own chapter, but they're both something we need to cover, and they're both related to contracts, so let's just put them into one chapter. So as you're reading this, I hope that usually when you read chapters in a textbook, you're thinking to yourself, how does this connect with the material I've already learned? And as you get more material, how does this connect to that new material? But don't try too hard to make a connection between the writing requirements and the interests of third parties, because the contract is pretty thin. The connection there is pretty thin, other than the fact that they both have to do with contract law. So as I said before, we're going to focus on written contracts first. Let's talk about why we prefer that contracts be in writing. Well, imagine that I enter into an oral contract with Bob. I am going to buy, we'll say he has a bakery, and I'm getting married, and he's going to make my wedding cake, and I'm going to pay him $500 for the wedding cake. And we've established how many layers it's going to be, how many people it's going to feed, what type of frosting it's going to have, what flavor the cake itself is going to be, and loads of other details. And we negotiate all these items. Probably Bob is going to want some of that $500 paid up front, and I'm probably going to insist that some of that money be paid at the time of delivery. So we work through all of those issues. Think about all of those specifics, how difficult it would be for Bob to keep those in his head. Presumably Bob is a professional baker, and so he has probably at any given time dozens of wedding cakes that he's working on. If he doesn't write it down, I may have wanted a French vanilla cake, and Sally Smith wanted a raspberry flavored cake, and if Bob isn't careful, he may end up giving me the raspberry flavored cake and Sally Smith the French vanilla flavored cake. There just is no reason to keep all of that in your head when you can forget it. Plus, let's say that Bob has a staff of 4 employees. Well, let's say he's called away to handle a difficult catering situation, and now it's time to bake my cake. Well, if the employee doesn't know exactly how it's supposed to be baked, if only Bob knows and Bob's not available, then the employee can't work on it. So when you don't have written records, you rely upon people's memories, which can be less than completely faithful. And it also requires that whomever negotiated it be present and available. Sometimes employees quit, or sometimes they die, or sometimes they forget. And so you can see for these reasons that it makes sense to memorialize things in writing. And in this example, you may have noticed that I don't assume any ill will or any hard feelings on anyone's part. But human nature is human nature. And the fact is that people sometimes lie. I know that's shocking to hear. Lawyers will tell you that everyone lies all the time. It's part of the human condition, and I don't think that's far from the truth. But certainly, you would be foolish to think, even somebody you know well, that when you enter into a contract with them, that there's no possibility that they will ever misremember a fact or intentionally lie. Well, if you write it down, you're really limiting their ability to meaningfully lie, at least about the terms of the contract. Another benefit to writing out a contract is that it forces the parties to be precise. Simply the act of writing it down forces both parties to think things through a little more carefully. For example, we may have negotiated the price of $500, but maybe we didn't actually work out exactly when the $500 would be due. In Bob's mind, he's expecting to get that immediately. In my mind, I'm expecting to pay him only after he's delivered the cake. We're thinking two different things. But if we're writing it down, especially if we're using some kind of form contract, that form will require that us add a date as to when the payment is due. And so as we're filling out, let's say Bob is the one with the pen, he may write down today's date or tomorrow's date. I go, wait a second. No, I'm not getting married and for 4 more months, so I want it to be that date. And Bob's like, oh no, that's not going to work for me. What about if we make 250 due immediately and 250 due at the time of the wedding? And so the act of writing it out, especially if we're working from some type of template, forces us to be precise, to address all of those specific issues, as opposed to just relying upon our ability to think on the sly and anticipate all those issues. One of the things you want to do in a contract is you want to anticipate all of the things that can go wrong. What if Bob's ovens fail? What if my fiance and I break up? What if as the cake is being transported from Bob's bakery to the reception site, the cake collapses and it's no longer aesthetically pleasing? All of those things would be smart topics for us to cover in the contract. And having a template kind of can put us in a position to address those issues. And so that can be a smart way of addressing those concerns. Another benefit to having a contract in writing is that when problems do arise, it makes the resolution of the problems a lot easier. Let me explain how this can be. Because we've anticipated what can go wrong, and let's say what happens is that my fiance and I break up the night before the wedding. The next day, I call Bob and say, we don't need that cake after all, and I'd like my $250 back. Bob is like, well, I'm sorry to hear that you're not getting married, but that's really not my problem. I've already baked the cake. It's already decorated. You owe me now. You're not getting back your $250 plus you owe me $250. Well, if we had an oral contract, we might end up in court over that issue. But if we have a written contract, especially a pretty complete one, there's probably some provision in that explains when can I back out of it, out of the contract, and for what reasons can I back out, and if I do back out, what do I get back? Let's say my fiance and I had called it off 3 months before the wedding, well, probably I'd be able to get most of my money back. Calling it off a week before, I'd probably get a little bit of my money. Well, maybe not so much my money back, but maybe I wouldn't have to pay any additional money. But calling it off the night before, after the cake is baked, probably I shouldn't get any money back under those circumstances. And again, Bob has an incentive to make sure that's handled right because he's in the wedding cake business. He knows sometimes weddings get canceled for lots of different reasons. And so when we have that dispute, we're going to turn to the contract language. I may not like the answer that the contract provides. Bob may not like the answer the contract provides. But when we read it in black and white, we realize, well, I don't like it, but this is the deal. This is what we negotiated. I can sue over this, but I know that I'm going to lose because of the wording of the contract. So why waste time? Why waste attorney's fees when I know what the final answer is going to be? And so that can help resolve the conflict without having to go through the litigation process. It can also reduce some of that emotionality. Again, in an oral contract situation that we hadn't worked out all those details, and Bob is telling me I'm not going to get a refund, I'm mad at Bob. But when Bob can be sympathetic, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that your wedding is being called off. Well, let's look at the contract together and see what we negotiated to see what our options are. He points to the contract. I mean, it's really hard to get that mad at Bob. I mean, it's there in black and white. And so it allows me to maybe redirect my anger at my cheating fiance perhaps, or at the wording of the contract, not so much at Bob. There is one more reason why written contracts, well, I guess there are kind of two more reasons why written contracts are good ideas. One is that the act of writing a contract is a bit of a serious moment, especially when you get to the point of signing the contract. When we're talking, it seems like it's just conversation. It doesn't feel that binding. I think we all have this idea that as long as we're talking, we're negotiating, it's still a little bit fluid. But once I'm putting my signature on something, there's a feeling of finality. Oh, this counts. This really matters. And so it causes us to step back a little bit and say, do I really want to do this? Are these the terms I'm really interested in? Have I thought through all the possibilities? It causes us to be a little bit more cautious. And that's a good thing, because it's good to be cautious during the contract drafting stage, so we'll have less contractor's remorse afterwards. So those are some advantages to written contracts, but the advantage that we're going to focus on today isn't one we've talked about yet. It's covered here in our last bullet, which is sometimes a writing is required. The law actually says we have to have a writing. We'll talk about why the law sometimes requires it, and we'll talk about what happens when a situation arises where a writing is required and yet there is no writing. How does the law resolve those issues in this and subsequent lectures? So let's go to our next slide. The statute that has to do with writings is called the Statute of Frauds. This name is awful. This is the name that we have in every state, as far as I know, other than Louisiana. To me, when I see this name, it sounds like it's a statute that's going to discuss how to prosecute frauds, right? Let's break from this for a second and let's go back to our chart of the elements of contract law. When we were talking about our elements, when we got to chapter 12, we were talking about, oh, here we go. We were talking about the 4 elements of contracts. We had agreement, we had consideration, we had contractual capacity, we had legal object. Under agreement, we drilled down and we talked about offer and we talked about acceptance. And in chapter 12, we talked about the importance of there being true assent between the offeror and the offeree. And we talked about 5 common problems with that. And one of those problems was misrepresentation. And you may recall that we talked about innocent, negligent, and fraudulent misrepresentation. And of course, fraudulent misrepresentation is a type of fraud, right? So when I see the term Statute of Frauds, my first thought would have been, oh, we're going back to this whole reality of assent. We're going to talk about circumstances in which one party has deceived the other party. And so that must be what the statute is about. What, how is the law going to address the issues where there's actual fraud? Well, that makes sense. That would be a logical interpretation, but it's almost completely wrong. This is an example where the law kind of sets us up for heartbreak, because that would make sense, that would be logical, but that's not the right answer. The statutes of frauds exist, as I said before, in all 49 of the states, not Louisiana. And of course, let's just pause here and remind ourselves why we don't have it in Louisiana. Louisiana is a civil code jurisdiction, right? It was part of France until 1803. France is the originator of the Napoleonic Code, which is that civil code that exists throughout Latin America, throughout continental Europe, and many, many other parts of the world. Not all those countries have the Napoleonic Code as their seminal code, but in many of those places, that's what they have as the basis. And certainly that is the basis of the Louisiana code system, because of the fact that they were owned or possessed by France during this important period of time. And even though they became part of the United States in 1803, they elected to keep their civil code. Perfectly good choice, nothing in the world wrong with that. But because they have a civil code, they didn't adopt the Statute of Frauds. The Statute of Frauds is a statute. It's not actually part of the common law, but the nature of the statute assumes a common law quote-unquote mentality. And so it makes sense that Louisiana Civil Code would say, we don't really need a statute of frauds. Our civil code addresses those issues already. So statutes of frauds we don't actually have in Louisiana. My guess is they don't have it in Puerto Rico either, but everywhere else in the United States, we're going to have some version of statute of frauds. Interestingly, the statute of frauds, the first statute of frauds, was developed in the 1600s in Great Britain. And so when Great Britain started developing colonies in Canada and the United States and India and throughout the globe, Africa, Asia, when it went to these various parts of the world, of course, it brought its legal system with it to these jurisdictions. And so that's how we came to have a statute of frauds. Great Britain, though, has actually eliminated its own statute of frauds. As far as I know, there aren't any remnants of the statute of frauds left. And if there are remnants, they're just small, small pieces. For the most part, the statute of frauds was eliminated in Great Britain sometime in the last, I think from 1950s to 1980s, the remnants were taken away. So it's a fairly recent development, especially given the fact that the original statute of frauds was developed in the 1600s. But it's no longer really a factor in Great Britain anymore. But it's still a big deal in the United States. And in fact, if anything, its importance has grown over the last several years. And there's no indication that there's any movement away from the statute of frauds in the United States. So we'll continue to have this. Of course, at this point, you're like, okay, Groover, we have this, but what is this? You're telling us what it's not. You're telling us the history of it, but you haven't really told us what it is. Well, you're right. So let me tell you what it is. As I said before, it's not about statute of frauds. In fact, the way I like to think about it is it's a statute of writing. That's not the name of it, but that's what it is. That there will be at least one test question that you have that will be a bit of a trick. And some students in the class will hear statute of frauds and they will think to themselves, oh, this must be about fraudulent transactions. And they answer the question on that basis. And of course, I'm going to immediately know that they didn't watch this lecture and they didn't read this chapter in the textbook. But that's not you. You are going to remember statute of frauds isn't about fraud. You're not going to fall for that trap. It's about requiring a writing. But there is some connection to fraud. I mean, the writers of the statute didn't completely out of whole cloth make up this idea of calling it a statute of frauds. It's not like the word fraud used to mean writing or something odd like that. No, fraud back in the 1600s meant basically what fraud means today. So the writers of the statute were concerned about frauds. Let's talk about a little bit about how the legal system worked back in the 1600s in merry old England. And probably how it was working in the United States at that time, although there weren't a lot of us over here, at least in the English-speaking parts of North America. Okay, so imagine we're in merry old England. We're in some little hamlet somewhere. This is the 1600s. Most people are peasants. Most people don't know how to read or write. They probably haven't traveled more than 10 or 20 miles, maybe 30 miles from their home in their entire lifetime. The whole idea of traveling is pretty scary because there literally are highwaymen. I mean, there are people like Robin Hood. Of course, they're not giving their money to the poor. They're keeping the money for themselves. But there's an opportunity to have very bad things happen to you if you wander around. The possibility of starving to death or dying from a plague of some type is a real concern. That happens to people on a pretty regular basis. Life is hard and then you die. I mean, that was kind of the life experience of peasants in England at that time and probably throughout most of the world at that time. So imagine that I am a peasant in England and I happen to be a lucky peasant, though I happen to own some land. I don't own a lot. I've got lots of mouths to feed in my family. So every year I'm concerned about, am I going to be able to grow enough food to feed them all? Because if I don't grow enough food, I mean, there's no welfare system, there's no Social Security, there's no savings account that I have to fall back upon. If there's not enough food, we die. That's plan B in this scenario. So anyway, I am out hoeing in my field, and 3 men approach on fancy horses. They're dressed nicely, expensively. Their horses are obviously expensive animals. I'm kind of confused what they're doing on my rather pitiful plot of land. They get off their horses, they approach me, and they say, "Mistress Gruber, nice to meet you." And they introduce themselves, and I curtsy. I recognize immediately that they are of a much higher social status than I am. They're gentlemen, they're educated, they've got obviously a significant amount of money, and the class structure was very, very strong back in England during this time. I'm rather afraid of them, to be honest with you. I'm not quite sure what to make of why they're here, but I'm thinking to myself, this is not going to work out well for me. And you know what? I'm right. It won't work out well for me. So one of the men steps forward and goes, you've got a lovely piece of land. I would like to buy it from you. And I look up surprised. Why does he want to buy my pitiful piece of land? I say, oh, thank you, sir, for your interest, but I need to have this land. This is the only item of any value that I own, and I need it to feed my family. If I don't own this land, I can't grow crops, and if I don't have crops, my family will starve. And then the man goes, well, I plan to pay you for the land. And I reply, well, thank you, you know, kind sir, but really, even if you give me money, we would just be able to live on that for a period of time, but I don't have any other skills, so eventually we'd run out of money and we would starve. So, I mean, there's no amount of money that you would reasonably be willing to give me that would make me want to sell my land, although thank you very much for your very kind offer. And then the man says, I don't think you understand. I am willing to pay you 10 pounds for this land. And I say, oh, well, that definitely wouldn't be enough. That with that money, I might be able to feed my family for a year, possibly even 2 years, but then the money would be gone and we would have no way to feed ourselves. So that amount would definitely not meet our needs. I thank you for the offer, but I will have to decline. Then the man goes, oh, thank you so much for accepting my offer. You've made me very happy. I look at him. He speaks with a strange accent, but I thought we were communicating. I say, oh, no, sir, I did not accept your offer. I declined your offer. I will not sell my land. And he's kind of clapping his friends on the back saying, she's accepted my offer. And I go, no, I haven't. And he says, well, I just heard you did accept my offer. No, sir, I did not accept your offer. Well, ma'am, you did. I mean, you can't change your mind after you've said that you would accept. We already have a contract. I'm like, no, we don't have a contract. And then the man goes, well, let's think about this for a second, Mistress Gruber. You are a poor peasant. My guess is you don't know how to read and you don't know any attorneys, and you wouldn't be able to afford an attorney even if you knew one. I am a wealthy man. My friends here are wealthy gentlemen. We do have access to attorneys, and all 3 of us are willing to testify that you agreed to allow me to buy your land for 5 pounds. And now you're trying to get out of your promise. The courts are not going to be happy with your sneaky behavior. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, this is terrible. What am I going to do? And the answer is, really, there's no opportunity for me. I would be 1 witness against 3 witnesses. I'm a poor peasant, and they are wealthy gentlemen. They would have counsel. I wouldn't even know how to negotiate through that system. And so, really, there is no recourse for me. The gentlemen are going to win. They will have stolen my land for a pittance, and I and my family will starve, and they will have this valuable asset. This was happening in England during this period of time. People were willing to perjure themselves pretty readily. They were willing to lie and come up with all these extravagant transactions that never happened. And so in order to prevent these frauds, the court said, or not the courts, but the legislature said, how can we stop this? Well, I mean, one solution would have been for the court system to say, peasants just can't sell their land at all. We're just not going to let them. That would have been one solution. But sometimes the peasants might actually benefit from selling the land. There might be reasons that that would be a good choice for them to make. And so it seemed like it was unnecessarily difficult to take away their right to sell land that they had some ownership interest in. And so then the parliament said, well, let's just require that the transaction be in writing. Now, this isn't a perfect solution. After all, in my story, I was illiterate. So how do I know what's in the document? And couldn't my signature be forged? Sure, there's still opportunities for fraud, even when a writing is required, but it does make it more difficult, especially with individuals who are literate. And so this was the fix. To avoid fraud, a writing requirement would make fraud less likely to occur. Let's go ahead and look at our statute of fraud in Texas. So I'm just going to flip on over to Texas statutes. This will be the first hit. Whenever you're interested in finding Texas statutes, just type in Texas statute. It'll be the first hit. Then I'm going to select the Business and Commerce Code, which is where our statute of frauds resides. And then as I look down here, I'm going to be able to see it's Chapter 26, Statute of Frauds. And here it is. It says, promise or agreement must be in writing. And it explains, first of all, in Section A, what is required for the writing. But the part that we're going to focus on right now is this talks about what types of agreements have to be in writing. And this goes through the particular fact pattern that have to be in writing. This is very, very consistent with what we'll be talking about from the textbook. Now, of course, our textbook is for all 50 states, so it's going to be a more generic look at the statute of frauds. But because our particular statute of frauds tracks really pretty tightly with what the textbook says, we're not going to have to focus too much upon Texas law, but this is what we have. These are the circumstances in which you need a statute of frauds, a writing, and we'll go through these in a few minutes when we actually see the list of requirements for statute of frauds. Okay, so we've talked about why we have the statute of frauds. What happens, though, when there is a legitimate contract and it is controlled by the statute of frauds? It falls into one of those categories where there has to be a writing, and yet there is no writing. It was just an oral arrangement. What are the courts going to do in those situations? Well, we'll talk about that in more detail in a subsequent lecture, but it does make the enforceability of the contract an issue for the courts to resolve. In some cases, the courts will enforce it. In some cases, the courts won't enforce it. Let's see if there's anything here we haven't already talked about. So this is the important takeaway. The statute of frauds does not relate to fraudulent contracts. It has nothing to do with fraudulent contracts. A contract that has to be in writing but wasn't fraudulent in any sense is still controlled by the statute of frauds. It has nothing to do with illegal contracts. It only has to do with categories of contracts that have to be in writing. And we've already talked about this. It helps to ease contractual negotiation. It helps the parties kind of think through all the specifics of what they need and what should happen if any problems arise. It also limits unreliable oral testimony. Bob can't lie and change the terms of our wedding cake scenario, and I can't lie and change the terms if we've written it all down. And it also causes people to kind of pause and think before they actually enter into a contract. People kind of benefit from that, catching their breath, and before they actually make that leap into a contract. So here we have 5 categories that are covered by the Statute of Frauds. And let's look at these and then we'll compare these to the Texas statute. Contracts whose terms prevent possible performance within 1 year. So this applies to situations in which it's impossible to complete the contract in 1 year. For example, if I own a janitorial service and you own a high-rise office building and you hire me to perform janitorial services on your high-rise office building for 13 months, guess what? We can't perform that within a year. I mean, you can't pre-clean. In the 13th month, there will need to be trash cans emptied, a carpet vacuumed, desks dusted, and all that kind of stuff. And so we'll have to be working in the 13th month just like we worked through months 1 through 12. And so we can't possibly complete that within 1 year. So this would require that it be in writing. Let's make a comparison to this is the similar requirement we have in Texas law. An agreement which is not to be performed within 1 year from the date of making the agreement. Then the next one is promises made in consideration of marriage. Back in the 1600s, many brides would, their parent, the father of the bride would negotiate with the groom or the groom's father a marriage settlement. And this would describe what the bride would bring, what kind of dowry she would bring to the marriage, and also what things the groom, the husband, would be bringing to the marriage. And this was a binding contract between the two families. And so those are the types of promises that we're talking about in this document. And we have here, in number 3, we have an agreement made in consideration of marriage or in consideration of a non-marital conjugal cohabitation. Then we have contracts for one party to pay the debt of another if the initial party fails to pay. You've probably heard this being described as co-signing for a loan. Imagine that you've got kind of a loopy cousin named Bob. Bob's a nice guy, you like him, but he's not so good about holding down a job or, frankly, paying his bills. And so he needs a new car, or he needs maybe a used car, but he needs a new car that's new to him, let's put it that way. And he goes down to the used car dealer. The used car dealer checks his credit and goes, Bob, I don't really see us giving you this car because you're not going to pay us for it. And so Bob then comes to you and goes, hey, cuz, if you'll I'll pay every month, but if you I can't get the car unless you co-sign, but it's just a formality because I'm going to pay every month. Well, guess what? It's a formality as long as Bob keeps on paying, but if you co-sign for the loan and Bob stops paying, well then the car dealer is going to come after you. So that's what paying for the debt of another entails. And let's look at the condition over here. Here we go, number 2. A promise by one person to answer for the debt, default, or miscarriage of another person. And then we have, and contracts related to an interest in land. And this is actually several. Here we have here, this one, number 4, a contract for the sale of real estate, a lease for real estate for a term longer than 1 year, a promise or agreement to pay a commission for the sale or purchase of an oil or gas mining lease, an oil or gas royalty, minerals, or a mineral interest. So we've gone through most of the categories that we have under Texas law. There are 2 that we haven't covered, and that is number 1, a promise by an executor or administrator to answer out of his own estate for a debt or damage due to from his testator or intestate. This is something that doesn't deal with business law, so we're not going to cover this in this particular class. And then the last one is just a quirky one under Texas law. An agreement, promise, or contract or warranty of cure relating to medical care or results thereof made by a physician or healthcare provider as defined by a particular statute. Again, kind of a quirky thing we have in Texas that isn't usually covered in the Statute of Frauds. But all the other parts are just straight from the garden variety Statute of Frauds. Now, there is one more part of the Statute of Frauds. It's really not part of the Statute of Frauds. It's part of the UCC that has to do with goods totaling more than $500. As you recall, the UCC stands for the Uniform Commercial Code. This is the statute that we have in Texas and in most other states that talks about how commercial transactions, sale of goods, will be handled. Let's go ahead and pull that up so we can see what that looks like in Texas. So I'm going to go back to here. I'm going to look under Chapter 2, which is our UCC sales section. And I'm going to look, here we have, right here, goods to be severed from real, 201, Formal Requirement Statute of Frauds. Let's go look at that. Here we have, except as provided in this section, a contract for the sale of goods for the price of $500 or more is not enforceable by way of action or defense unless there is some writing sufficient to indicate that a contract for sale has been made between the parties and signed by the party against whom enforcement is sought or by his authorized agent or broker. So we see $500 or more is the standard in Texas, just like the textbook says, and just like is true in most states that have the UCC. So these are the 5 that you'll be responsible for in this class. So a very possible question that you might see on a test is, list the 5 bases or 5 situations in which the Statute of Frauds is covered. And these would be the 5 that you list. Whenever, this is true not just for this class, but certainly for this class, whenever you see a list of items, that's usually a pretty good indicator that you ought to have those in your brain, in your memory. Come up with some kind of mnemonic that'll help you get those in your head in a way that you'll be able to retrieve them when it comes time for tests. Okay, so now we're going to drill down and go through each one of these. We're going to approach this first one first. Contracts whose terms prevent possible performance within 1 year. Okay, the first thing is that it's not, going back to the example wherein I enter into a contract to perform janitorial services. Let's say that the actual contract is just for 11 months though, but it's not supposed to start for 4 months. Let's say that you, the high-rise owner, has currently a different janitorial service and you have decided you're not happy with them, so as soon as their contract is over, you want to replace. Well, you don't want to wait till last minute, and so you're negotiating with me now for this transition that will happen in 4 months. Well, if my contract with you will be for a period of 11 months and it's not going to start for 4 months, then that means it won't be over until 15 months from today's date. Well, that's clearly more than a year, and so the Statute of Frauds would apply to that. So it's not so significant how long the contract from beginning to end lasts in terms of performance, but from the time that the contract is signed until the final performance is over. That's the period of time we care about. Another issue that comes up in these situations is that sometimes it's hard to know how long it's going to take you to complete the contract. I mean, if it says a 13-month janitorial contract, you know it's going to take, 13 months. But let's say I am building a house. Let's think for a second about the house that Deion Sanders built in Salina, Texas. If you've ever gone up Preston Road, north, you probably saw it's a little bit less obvious now. I think it's next door to a Kroger now, but for a time going up north Preston into Salina, there was this mansion kind of out in the middle of nowhere. Now it's kind of in the middle of things, but back in the day it was in the middle of nowhere, and it was a real mansion. As you could imagine, Mr. Sanders, a very wealthy man. Well, imagine that he came to you, you're a contractor, building contractor, and he goes, look, I want you to build my house. And of course, you're thinking, this is going to be great. This is going to be a huge place. I'm going to make a lot of money. Plus, I'm going to get to be somewhat famous in the industry. And so I'm probably going to be able to generate more sales from this. So you are very interested in this transaction. Anyway, you find out his plans for the building, and you see it's going to be a huge job. And as you're planning it out, you think to yourself, well, there's lots of moving pieces here. I'm going to have lots of different contractors involved. There'll be people who pour the cement, people who clear the land, people who do landscaping, people who lay bricks, people who do painting and other work, people who frame out the house, people who put in the appliances, just lots of different skills. And planning all of those moving pieces together is a pretty involved process. Plus, lots of things can go wrong. There can be bad weather. If it's raining a lot or windy, or other circumstances can make it difficult to complete or stay on schedule. Also, sometimes there can be parts and fixtures that aren't available. Let's say Mr. Sanders wants a very specialized chandelier in his dining room. Well, it may not be available immediately. We might have to back order something like that. And so that might delay, if we have enough of those things, that might delay when we get things completed. Also, let's say there's a lot of construction work going on in the community around this time. So it may be that it's hard for me to get workers out at a particular time because there's more demand for workers of that particular specialty than there are workers who are interested in working. And so I may not be able to get workers to come out on exactly the right day. So you can see that there's lots of moving pieces in this situation. But let's say I plan out and I think, well, if everything goes perfectly, if we never have a rainy day, if we never have a windy day, if we never have any difficulty getting workers out there, if workers are willing to work late into the night, if they're willing to work on Saturdays and Sundays and Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's, if there are never any things that we have to redo, if there's never anything that we have to back order, all of those things, if everything works like clockwork, and of course that's completely unrealistic because you never have a situation where everything works out, but let's just live in this fantasy land for a while. If everything works out perfectly, I think that we could get the house done in about 49 weeks. That is less than 1 year. Now, let's say that is, as I'm planning, I think it's possible to get it out 49 weeks, but I would tell Mr. Sanders, it's mathematically possible we get it done in 49 weeks, but it's more realistic that it's going to take us 60 to 70 weeks for a building project this big. It might even take longer. It actually ends up taking us 69 weeks. Now the question is, did the statute of frauds require that we put it into writing? You could say that it did because it actually took more than a year. Obviously, 67 weeks is longer than, or I think I said 69 weeks. 69 weeks is longer than a year. But actually, if it's possible, though highly unlikely, that we could get it done in 49 weeks is less than a year. So because it was possible that we could have completed the performance in less than a year, it's not really relevant if we did actually have that perfect performance. So the test is about possibility, not about likelihood. Let's explore this example. So I go to a job interview, and Bob interviews me. It goes well. He decides to hire me. I get on board with the company, and Bob just really seems to take a shine to me. I've been there about 6 months. He stops by my office one day, goes, "Scroover, things just run so much better since you got here. I mean, I really feel like the productivity of your department is just amazing. You're so pleasant to work with. You work late, you come in early, you work the weekends, you never complained. It's just everything is great. I want to let you know that you've got a job here for as long as you want it. It's lifetime employment for you." Wow, boss, thanks. That's so important to me. I really do appreciate that. He slaps me on the back and he goes back to work. 6 more months pass, and there's been a few bumps in the road. Bob's also a little fickle. He's hired a new person, and he now seems to like Sally better than me. And Sally is now the golden child, the person who seems to get everything right. And when I ever open my mouth, Bob is saying, that's a bad idea, or, you know, why didn't you think of that idea earlier? He's always saying that I ought to be more efficient with my time. And he keeps on saying that I need to produce more work. Really, the relationship has soured. Well, 6 months later, he comes to me and goes, Groover, I need you out of here. This will be your last day working for me. I say to Bob, Bob, I mean, you told me I'd have a job here for life. I've really counted on this job. Surely you don't mean this. Bob goes, I mean it. I do mean it. I need you out of here. You did not work out. At first you looked like you were going to, but no, you have not worked out. You're fired. So I pack my bags and I leave, but then I sue him. I file a lawsuit saying that Bob breached his contract of lifetime employment with me. Am I going to win or am I not? Well, certainly a lifetime seems longer than 1 year, but think about it. None of us knows how long we're going to live. Bob could have given me that contract of lifetime employment, and I could have gotten hit by a train the next day. Well, guess what? Then my lifetime would have been exactly 1 day. It's possible that my lifetime contract could have been performed in less than a year, or even in less than a day. So therefore, a contract for lifetime employment is not a contract that has to be in writing, because it can possibly be performed within 1 year. Now, I don't want to put too much hope in this being a way to secure continuous employment. There are other problems, especially in Texas, with a contract for lifetime employment. We'll talk, having to do with at-will employment. So I'm not going to focus on those issues, but just keep in mind that lifetime is less than 1 year. The law is a very pessimistic idea of how long I may live. Okay, so we've covered that first element of the Statute of Frauds. Let's go on and talk about our next element, promises in consideration of marriage. So the example that I gave was of, during earlier discussion, was of a marriage settlement back in the 1600s, when the initial Statute of Frauds was written. At least wealthy people, the bride would come to her marriage with a dowry, with a significant amount of money and stuff that she would be contributing to the family that she was creating with her groom. And that would be established through this contract. And the contract would say what she was bringing. And if she didn't bring it, she would be in breach of that particular agreement. And the husband sometimes would also bring things forward. And this is not an unusual arrangement in non-industrialized societies. In fact, there are parts of the world that continue to have marriage settlements of this type, even though they're relatively unusual in the United States today, for example. But we have something similar. We don't have the marriage settlement, but we do have promises made in consideration of marriage, and these are called prenuptial agreements or premarital agreements. These would be situations in which, let's say, Bob is a wealthy man. Maybe he was a sports star. Well, we'll use Deion Sanders as an example. Let's say Deion Sanders, who's obviously got a significant net worth, let's say he decides he wants to try love again. He wants to get remarried, and he finds a young, or maybe young, maybe not, but a lady whom he cares for deeply. Her name is, we'll say, Sally. Sally is a nice, hardworking, a good person, but she's not wealthy. Dion's been burned before, or he feels he's been burned before by women who maybe were more interested in his bank account than himself, and so he thinks Sally can be trusted, but he doesn't want to risk his entire fortune. So he wants her to enter into a prenuptial agreement before they marry. He wants to marry her, but if things go awry in the marriage, he doesn't want to lose a significant portion of his assets. And so an approach that he could use would be a prenuptial agreement. These are entered into, as you can see, the nuptial is the marriage, so pre-marriage agreements. So you enter into this before the marriage, and this would define what the parties would be entitled to when the marriage ends, whether it end via divorce or whether it end via the death of one of the parties. These types of agreements are generally enforceable in Texas and in most jurisdictions, but they do need to be in writing. And there are additional requirements in most states, including Texas. For example, in order to have a binding prenuptial agreement, the agreement, or both parties to the agreement have to have a very complete understanding of the financial assets of the other party. And both parties to the agreement have to have had time to consider the agreement. So I can't present this to my fiance 30 minutes before we're to exchange wedding vows, for example. Or if I present a contract to him and I've hidden half of my net worth, and he signs it given this incomplete information, under either one of those scenarios, we probably don't have a binding prenuptial agreement. But again, it can be binding, and this is the type of promise nowadays that we would see that would need to be in writing. So why were people concerned back in the 1600s about having these promises in writing? Again, they weren't focused upon the prenuptial agreement, they were focused upon the marriage settlement. Well, let's think about it for a second. We'll have to enter a different mindset that existed in the 1600s. Back then, a young lady might marry when she's 16, 17, 18, certainly probably in her early 20s, if not before. So she was relatively young, probably relatively inexperienced with life, probably hadn't worked outside the home or been responsible for significant management of money. So here she is being courted. Let's say she's a woman with a significant dowry. Well, lots of gentlemen might be courting her or seeking her hand in marriage, some of them because they sincerely cared about her, but some of them perhaps because of her sizable dowry, her sizable inheritance. And so under those circumstances, the father might be very concerned about his young daughter's judgment in these areas. She doesn't have a lot of life experience, so she may not be able to tell the fortune hunters from the more worthy gentlemen that she might have occasion to meet. Young people at that age can be impulsive, they can be swept away by emotions, they can make a decision that they end up regretting. And keep in mind, back in the 1600s, there was no such thing really as divorce, unless, of course, you were the King of England or something like that. So once you married somebody, you were stuck with them until, they died or you died. And so you really marry in haste, repent in leisure, as they say. So it was a very, very big decision to make. Also, another concern with why the fathers were so interested in making sure that these promises were well considered and that they be in writing was that there was the possibility of fraud. Let's go back to our story. You may recall the story I told earlier about the peasant who was approached by the wealthy men who wanted to buy her land. Well, let's switch up those facts a little bit. Let's imagine that now I am the 19-year-old debutante heiress, and I am at the great ball, and a handsome but penniless young man approaches me and wants to dance with me. And so we're dancing on the floor, and it's oh so romantic, oh so awesome. And he whisks me onto the balcony of this mansion, and he's talking with me and saying how much he cares for me. And then he says, "Miss Groover, would you do me the great honor of agreeing to be my wife?" And I go, "Oh, "Oh, no, 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 I can't do that. My father would never permit it. You're a fortune hunter, and I'm not allowed to marry someone like that." He looks at me and he says, "Oh, thank you. You've made me the happiest, luckiest man alive." I think, did you hear me? Because I said no. And two men pop up from behind a potted fern on the balcony and say, "We just heard the good news. Miss Gruber has accepted your proposal of marriage." And now they're whisking me off into the dance floor saying, "Great news. Miss Gruber will be my bride." I'm stunned. What the heck is going on here? I don't know what to say. Everybody is clapping and cheering, and I'm turning red with mortification, but no one's really even listening to me at this point. Well, under those circumstances, if this type of settlement didn't have to be in writing, but just had to be a situation of oral agreement, the willingness of my would-be fiancé and his two friends to lie about my acceptance could force me into a marriage that I don't want to be in. Many times when people talk about the way people lived in the 1600s, and they talked about things like chaperones and things like that, many times people interpreted that to be about, oh, well, they were concerned about the virtue of the young lady, and I'm sure that was a concern. But part of the reason why the chaperones were there was so that the man would not trick the woman into agreeing to a marriage or lie about what the woman said. Because again, before the Statute of Frauds, an oral agreement to marry could be legally binding. So we can see that we want to have agreements in consideration of marriage in writing because they're so significant, and they're set at emotional times where people can be swept away by emotion, and maybe not make the best decision. But the act of writing it out and contemplating it in a serious and sober way can cause people to make perhaps better decisions. So we've covered the first two of our statute of fraud situations. Now we're going to talk about our third one. By the way, this is an example of a traditional Jewish marriage contract. And in fact, when Jewish couples marry today, many times they will enter into this type of contract, even when they marry in the United States. Now, obviously, it's not a binding legal contract in the sense that it's enforceable in the court system, although it probably would be enforceable in a Jewish court situation. But it is a contract that has a great deal of religious significance for folks. And there are other cultures that also have things that are similar to that. So let's go on to point number 3. This is contracts for one party to pay the debt of another if the initial party fails to pay. Okay, there's lots of different names for this. I've called it conversationally kind of co-signing that scenario. But the more formal names for it are secondary promises, collateral promises, or suretyship promises. These are all different ways of describing this particular transaction. Now you can see all of these terms imply that, that there's another transaction that's the main part. For example, this is the main part of the transaction. The creditor is giving money, sorry, to the debtor, and the debtor is promising to repay the money, typically with interest. This is the primary obligation. This is what the transaction is about. Then we have the secondary obligation down here. I'm going to put this in a dotted line. You don't have to have this. I mean, if the debtor has a good credit score, there's no need to have this secondary person. And many times, most of the time, in fact, you only have this primary situation. This primary situation usually doesn't have to be in writing. I mean, it's a good idea for it to be in writing. Certainly, it's a smart idea really for any contract to be in writing. But the Statute of Frauds doesn't require that it be in writing. But this secondary contract with the surety, or with the person who's signing for the debt of another, that does have to be in writing. So this does not have to be in writing. No writing. Whereas this one has to be in a writing. So why do we require writing for this secondary obligation when we don't for the primary? It has to do with the fact that really the surety or the guarantor is a volunteer. He's not getting anything out of this. I mean, the debtor is getting money from the creditor, right? So we understand why the debtor's getting involved in this transaction. And the debtor is promising to repay the creditor whatever he's borrowing plus some interest. So we understand why the creditor is interested in this transaction. But the surety, he's just being a super nice guy. It's like when you co-sign for your cousin Bob's car. You know why Bob wants the car. You know why the car dealer wants to sell Bob the car. You are the one who's a big question mark. Why the heck are you helping your cousin Bob? You're probably doing it because you're a super nice person in Bob's family, right? And under those circumstances, you're just being a really, really nice guy. You're not doing it to advance a business purpose or some kind of self-interest. Many times in the law, when somebody just seems to be doing something really, really nice because they're a super nice person, the law's a little suspicious of that. They think to themselves, really? Are you sure you want to do that? I mean, that's super nice of you to do that, but kind of stop and think, because we don't want to bind you to something that you're going to end up regretting when you're just being super nice, because we've all been in those situations where somebody asks us to do something and we don't quite know how to get out of it, so we might kind of sort of say, yeah, maybe, okay, and you're thinking to yourself, I don't really want to do that. But when you're given a contract and a pen is put in your hand and now it's the moment, I either sign or not, that's the time that I might say, Bob, I like you a lot. I hope things work out for you, but I'm not signing that because I know how you are about jobs and I don't want to pay for your car. And so that act of me actually having to put sign my name on that document kind of makes it real for me, kind of forces me to think, is this a good deal for Groover? And causes me to have that moment of reflection. So this contract doesn't have to be in writing because everybody knows what the parties are entering into it. This one has to be in writing. But there's an exception to even this requirement. These contracts with the surety don't have to be in writing if the main purpose, under the main purpose rule, also called the leading object rule, but we'll call it the main purpose rule for this case, for this class. And sometimes the surety isn't being a super nice guy. Sometimes the surety is agreeing to guarantee the loan or guarantee the repayment, not because the debtor is his cousin, but because he has a personal stake in the transaction. Imagine that the surety in this case is Bob the rock star. And you know what? He's had some ups and downs in his life, and he's gotten into some trouble from time to time. And guess what? He lost his license a few years ago. It's a whole big story. We don't need to go into that. So he has a chauffeur driving around. And actually, it's worked out pretty well for him because he can be in the back of his limousine enjoying the good life with his party crew, drinking and having just a wild time. He doesn't have to worry about driving. And so he has a favorite chauffeur, and that is Pete. Pete's a great guy. Actually, Pete parties with him some too, not when he's driving the car, but at other times. Pete knows all the best places to take Bob, and they just seem to really be simpatico. There's just a real connection there. Anyway, Bob always wants Pete to be his limo driver whenever Bob is in that particular town. Well, Pete has been working for Limousines or Us for several years, but he'd really like to branch out into his own limousine service. He wants to call it Pete's Limousines. And he's got a little bit of savings, but these limousines do not come cheap, right? And the type of limo that Bob wants is super stretch. It's going to be a bucket load of money, several $100,000 when all is said and done. And Pete doesn't have that kind of cash. So Pete goes to the bank and says, hey, I'd like this amount of money in loan, we'll say $500,000, to get myself started in the limousine business. The creditor runs a credit report on Pete. Pete's credit's okay, but he just doesn't have enough money to justify this type of loan. So the creditor says, Pete, we're going to turn you down. Pete's devastated, so he goes, calls up Bob and says, hey, Bob, I know you like for me to be your limousine driver, but I no longer work for Limousines R Us, and it doesn't look like I can start my own limousine business. I think I'm going to have to get another job. I was like, what? You have to be my limo driver. This is you're my lucky limo driver. I'm not going to be able to get on stage if I don't have my lucky limo driver. So I need you. I need you to be driving me. He's like, well, Bob, I told you I just can't get the loan. Well, but what can I do to help make this happen? Well, Pete says, I guess you could co-sign. I mean, you must have several $1 million in assets, and I think the creditor would be willing to loan me the money. And if I get the money, I can buy the limo, and I can start Pete's Limousines, and I can drive you wherever you want me to take you. Bob's like, yes, that is what we need to do, because I need you to be driving me, because I won't be able to perform in front of a crowd if I don't have you chauffeuring me around. Well, in this case, Bob isn't agreeing to co-sign Pete's loan because Bob is a super nice guy. He's doing it because it advances his goal. Maybe he's got stage fright, and knowing that Pete's driving him is going to help him not be so fearful getting on the stage. So Bob is getting a personal benefit from the transaction, and therefore the main purpose rule says we actually don't need the contract to be in writing, because unlike the typical example where Pete, the debtor, is just your cousin, your loser cousin, but is in fact, and so you're doing it just out of niceness, Bob isn't doing it out of niceness, because we understand now that Bob has his own personal motivation for it. This contract looks a lot more like this contract. There's a logic to why they're entering into it, and therefore the statute of frauds does not apply. Okay, now we're to contracts related to an interest in land, and this goes back to that first example that I gave about me being a peasant in 1600s England. And of course, land is a very unique tool. I'll share a little bit of a story. I come from I'm an 8th generation Texan, and my grandfather came to see me. My grandmother and grandfather, both of them came up to see me when I was 30 years old. I had just bought my first house in Plano. I was a single woman, and I proudly show him around, and the house was a very starter house, very simple house, but they were impressed by it. And my grandfather looked around and kind of looked in all the closets, and he said to me, he goes, Cindy, this is a very fine house you have. I don't think you have a thing to worry about. I'm like, okay, well, thank you, grandfather. I wasn't worried, but thank you. He goes, yep, I think now that you have a house, you'll be able to find yourself a husband. And in his mind, again, from a different generation, that if I had real property, the husbands would be lining up wanting to court me, kind of like the dowry situation that we talked about before, because land in my grandfather's mind was the only thing of real value. He thought of land as being much more valuable than cash in the bank, because he had lived through the Great Depression. He knew cash in the bank could vanish, but land doesn't vanish. And worst case scenario, you can always grow stuff on the land and feed your family. So he saw land as having a very special type of worth. And that's frankly true in most parts of the world for most of human history. And certainly would have been true for that peasant back in the 1600s. And so the way we treat land recognizes the special connection that we as human beings have to the land and to our continuing existence. Okay, so what is land? Well, land is real property. It includes the land and the soil and anything that's permanently attached to the land and the soil. So it would be a building, trees. It wouldn't include crops because those crops will be harvested over time. It wouldn't include, say, a mobile home or a car because that could be moved. So all those things are an interest in land. When we're talking about real property, we're not limiting ourselves to only buying and selling circumstances, but also to leases and mortgages. And of course, in Texas, we pretty commonly will separate the surface estate from the mineral estate. When we're talking about a fee simple absolute, we think about the surface estate being literally what's on the surface of the land, the crops that you grow, what buildings you build on the land. We think of that as being separate from the mineral estate. Many times both of those estates will be together, and the person who owns the surface estate also owns the mineral estate, but it's also very possible in Texas that you might have two separate owners. One person who owns the surface estate, the land and the stuff above the soil and on the soil, and someone else might own the mineral estate, the oil, the natural gas, the diamonds, the gold, whatever might be underneath the ground. So now we've covered the 4 categories that we're going to cover from the Statute of Frauds. And now we're on to that UCC section. So this is not technically part of the Statute of Frauds, but because it is the section of the UCC that requires a writing, we're going to kind of treat it as if it were part of the Statute of Frauds. And here the amount that's relevant is $500. Whenever you see dollar amounts or any other kind of number like this, by the way, you don't need to know this number. I'm not going to ask you for that kind of information. But when you see numbers like 500 or 4 years or whatever the number is, that's probably a good thing for you to file away. You will want to know this number so that when you're taking a test, you'll be able to recall that. Okay, so this would be contracts for the sale of goods totaling more than $500 have to be in writing. But the writing requirement is very limited under the UCC. It's more limited, in fact, than we have under the Statute of Frauds, and we'll talk more about what the writing requirement is under the Statute of Frauds in a subsequent lecture. You only need to include the quantity that's going to be sold. You don't have to state who the buyer is. You don't have to state who the seller is. You don't have to state the price. You don't even have to state the method of payment. So the writing requirement of the UCC is very, very minimal, but there is some writing requirement if you're going to sell something more than $500. You can see in all of these cases, we have something of significant value. In each one of these cases, we're talking about something of significant value, and or it's a situation where people's emotions might be in play. And so under those circumstances, those are the situations in which we require something be in writing. So this ends our first lecture on Chapter 13, the section talking specifically about the Statute of Frauds. I hope that this information has been helpful for you. If you have any questions about this content, please feel free to come to my office hours, to send me an email, or to raise those questions in class. Thanks again for your attention, and I hope you have a great day.